Native American Heritage Day did not begin as a single law or a sudden declaration. Its roots stretch back through centuries of survival, resistance, memory, and the quiet insistence of Native peoples that their stories mattered and deserved to be remembered on their own terms. Long before there was a calendar date, there was a struggle to be seen as living nations rather than relics of the past. Before European contact, the land that would later be called the United States was home to hundreds of native nations, each with its own language, laws, spiritual beliefs, and systems of governance. These societies were not frozen in time. They were dynamic, adaptive, and deeply connected to the land. Trade routes crossed vast distances. Oral histories preserved knowledge of astronomy, agriculture, medicine, and ethics. Identity was tied to community and responsibility, not just territory. When colonization began, it brought violent disruption. Land seizure, disease, forced conversion, broken treaties, and war shattered native populations. Yet native nations endured. Even as governments tried to erase them through policy and assimilation, native communities preserved language, ceremony, and kinship in private spaces and through oral tradition. Memory became an act of resistance. By the late 19th and early 20th centuries, U.S. policy focused heavily on forced assimilation. Native children were removed from their families and sent to boarding schools where they were punished for speaking their languages or practicing their cultures. The message was clear. To survive, native identity had to disappear. Yet it did not. Many of those children grew into adults who quietly carried traditions forward, even when doing so was dangerous. As the 20th century progressed, native leaders began pushing back more publicly. They challenged federal policies, demanded recognition of treaty rights, and worked to educate the wider public. One of the earliest efforts to create a day. As Native American Heritage Day slowly took shape, its meaning deepened through the lived realities of Native communities across the country. It was never meant to be only symbolic. For many Native people, the day became a response to generations of misrepresentation, silence, and selective memory. It was about reclaiming narrative control in a society that had long spoken about Native people without listening to them. One of the biggest challenges Native American Heritage Day tried to confront was the way Native history had been taught. For decades, school textbooks reduced Native nations to a few early encounters with settlers and then quietly removed them from the story. Students learned Native names only in the context of conflict or disappearance. This created the false idea that Native people belonged only to the past. Heritage Day pushed against that idea by emphasizing continuity. Native nations still exist. They govern themselves, defend their lands, vote, create art, serve in the military, and raise families. They are doctors, teachers, activists, engineers, and storytellers. The day encouraged schools and institutions to bring Native voices into the present tense. Education became one of the strongest pillars of the observance. Tribal educators worked with schools to introduce accurate history and cultural knowledge. Elders visited classrooms to share stories that had been passed down orally for generations. These stories were not myths or legends in the way outsiders often framed them. They were historical memory, moral teaching, and cultural identity woven together. Language revitalization also became central to Heritage Day discussions. Many native languages were nearly lost due to forced assimilation policies. By the late 20th century, some had only a handful of fluent speakers left. Native American Heritage Day gave communities a public platform to highlight language programs, immersion schools, and the urgent need to preserve linguistic knowledge. As Native American Heritage Day became more widely recognized, it also began to expose uncomfortable truths about how the nation related to Native people in the present, not just the past. The day increasingly forced a shift from passive appreciation to active awareness. Honoring heritage meant confronting systems that still shaped Native lives in unequal ways. One of the most important issues brought into focus was sovereignty. Many Americans were unaware that Native tribes are legally recognized nations with the right to govern themselves. Heritage Day events often addressed this misunderstanding directly. Tribal leaders used the day to explain how sovereignty affects education, healthcare, policing, and economic development. These were not abstract legal concepts. They shaped daily life. Economic challenges also became part of the conversation. While native nations have made major strides in areas like business development and self-governance, many communities still face high poverty rates, limited access to healthcare, and underfunded schools. Heritage Day did not exist to romanticize native culture while ignoring these realities. It created space to discuss them openly and without shame. Health disparities were another critical focus. Generations of trauma, combined with inadequate federal support, led to higher rates of chronic illness in many Native communities. During Heritage Day observances, Native healthcare workers and advocates highlighted traditional healing practices alongside modern medicine. This approach emphasized balance rather than replacement. Tradition and science were not treated as opposites. Environmental protection emerged as a defining theme. Native nations have long described themselves as caretakers of the land. In recent decades, that role became highly visible as tribes led resistance against pipelines, mining projects, and water contamination. Heritage Day gave context to these struggles. It showed that environmental activism was not. As Native American Heritage Day continued to evolve, its focus naturally turned toward the future and the responsibilities that come with remembrance. By this stage, the day was no longer only about correcting the past or acknowledging survival. It became a question of what kind of relationship Native nations and the wider society would build moving forward. For Native communities, the future was inseparable from self-determination. Heritage Day increasingly highlighted efforts led by tribes themselves, not solutions imposed from outside. Tribal governments expanded control over education, healthcare, housing, and environmental management. These efforts reflected a long-held belief that Native nations know what is best for their people. The day reinforced the idea that honoring heritage also meant respecting Native authority. Youth leadership became one of the strongest signs of this future. Young Native activists organized climate campaigns, language revitalization projects, and digital archives to preserve oral history. Many of them used social media and film to tell stories that earlier generations had been denied the tools to share. Heritage Day gave visibility to these voices, showing that Native identity was not static or outdated, but innovative and forward-looking. Technology played a growing role. Tribes used digital platforms to teach endangered languages, document ceremonies for future generations, and connect members separated by distance. Heritage Day events increasingly included virtual gatherings, online workshops, and live-streamed discussions. This expansion showed that tradition and technology were not opposites. They could strengthen each other. Economic independence also gained attention. Many tribes invested in sustainable businesses, renewable energy projects, and cultural tourism led by Native communities themselves. Heritage Day helped shift public perception away from dependency narratives toward stories of resilience and entrepreneurship. It